Well, to discuss this further, I'm joined now from Boston by Yaser Tabbara. He's a founding member of the opposition Syrian National Council and a senior fellow at the Omran Centre for Strategic Studies. In Baghdad, we have Mark Kimmitt. He is a retired U.S. Army Brigadier General, and completing our panel from Moscow is Sergey Markov. He's a former member of the Russian Parliament and director of the Institute of Political Studies. Thanks all so much for joining us. Yaser, Russia believes, at least, that it is, in a sense, protecting civilians from extremist groups like Jaish al-Islam, working out of Eastern Ghouta. Why do you believe that's a farce?
Because the total number of extremists that belong to Al-qaeda or that are affiliated with Al-qaeda, as we have accurate information from the ground, is literally 398 members. They're about 1,000 total if you count their family members, their wives, their children, etc. We're talking about an area of 97 square kilometer that has 400,000 civilians that has been targeted on a daily basis by tens of rockets and missiles via the Russian Air Force and the Syrian regime heavy artillery, and with an average of 81 civilians killed every single day. We're talking about the indiscriminate targeting of hospitals. About every single hospital within that 97 square kilometer area has been deliberately targeted. We're talking about local councils, we're talking about administrative units. The indiscriminate targeting, as we have observed it and have recorded it through the Omran Centre website, there's a very clear map as to which areas within the Eastern Ghouta area have been specifically targeted. And you'll see that the areas that have extremists in them basically take the least amount of brunt in terms of the targeting. What the Russians and the Syrian regime are trying to do is not fight terrorists. They are trying to exterminate this entire area, this entire pocket of resistance, just like they did in Western Ghouta and Daraya in the past, that's like they did in East Aleppo in the past. What they're trying to do is basically have a campaign of forced cleansing of anyone who disagrees with the central government, whether they are a civilian, an armed group, a child that goes to a school, an old man that's waiting in line to get his daily bread in a bakery.
Okay.
That's what's going on in Ghouta.
We're hearing now that from Yaser that behind the mask of attacking legitimate targets like Al-qaeda affiliated groups, Russia and the regime can also target legitimate resistance groups illegally and against the ceasefire.
As already mentioned, of course, Damascus would be interesting to include peaceful opposition to the future peace coalition government. And Damascus will be happy if this coalition worked in Eastern Ghouta. But it didn't work. We know that Damascus had been shelled from the Eastern Ghouta every day during those months. And finally, after Syrian government has free troops, which they took them from the Idlib area, after some agreement with Turkey, they started its offensive operation in Eastern Ghouta. I think this situation in Eastern Ghouta will be finished in the few weeks, as it has been happening in Aleppo.
Let me turn to Mark Kimmitt, joining us from Baghdad. I mean, what do you make of Russia's claims that it actually is interested in protecting civilians, even in Eastern Ghouta, from terrorist groups?
Well, I think it is just foolish if the Russians are suggesting that their actions are in any way protecting the civilians while they are carpet bombing Eastern Ghouta. On the other hand, the Syrian resistance is not without blame. They are intentionally using human shields in that area and civilian casualties for the simple purpose of raising the telegenic suffering that's going on. There's a very simple solution. We've seen it in the past in history, and that's to declare Eastern Ghouta an open city. They could easily allow military forces inside to make sure that they don't affect the civilians, but for some reason, I don't know why they choose not to do that. Nonetheless, the majority of blame goes to the Russians. They should be ashamed of themselves. They should be taken to the International Criminal Court. They and the Syrian regime that they are propping up are daily committing war crimes, which are against any norms of civilized behavior, and for that they should be condemned.
Okay, yeah, so I can see you disagreed. I'll let you say your piece there.
Well, a couple of things. First of all, I don't know where the claim that some of these groups are using humans or civilians as human shields. In fact, actually, we are in direct contact with the local councils that have been administering these areas for the past 5 years. Really, which, I mean, it is important to mention that this area has been the subject of a fierce siege by the Syrian regime for the past at least 5 years. Those local councils and those who are responsible to administer the affairs of these people have issued a number of highly cooperative statements, especially after the UN resolution, the Security Council resolution that came out a few days ago, in basically support of implementing as much as possible of that resolution. They have come up with a number of mechanisms to monitor any violations that take place of that Security Council resolution. They're very cognizant of the fact that they need to be on their absolute best behavior. The other thing that I need to address is what your guest from Moscow was alluding to earlier in terms of shelling of these groups into Damascus as a retaliation or response to the carpet bombing campaign that has been taking place of Eastern Ghouta. All I say here is that statistically, if we compare the amount of casualties on either side, you'll see an incredibly desperate, not even subject to comparison. We have 3 or 4 reported casualties on the side of Damascus versus more than 500 civilians killed in the most brutal of ways just in the past few weeks within this 97-kilometer enclave that has been subject to brutal siege over the past 5 years, as I mentioned.
Okay, Sergey, I believe you've been able to at least hear the exchange, even though we seem to have lost, and it seems we've lost your video connection once again. So, Yaser, I just have to ask you this though, and this is on behalf of Russia's position here. Are you scared that what you feel are the horrors of the Assad regime could actually fall to something even worse in the form of extremist groups like Jaish al-Islam that Russia says it wants to protect people from?
Jaish al-Islam has issued a number of statements that basically shows that they're cooperating fully with the international community in terms of what is to be done in Eastern Ghouta. In fact,
Yaser, are you sure you're not being naive? These are groups that are affiliated with Al-qaeda.
Jaish al-Islam is not affiliated with Al-qaeda.
Okay,
actually, I'm not.
We can argue the case. Jabhat al-Nusra is there. Hayat Tahrir al-Sham is there.
Well, of course, and there is an ongoing war between these factions. Jaish al-Islam, Faylaq al-Rahman are in ongoing wars with Hayat Tahrir al-Sham and with Al-Qaeda, with Al-Nusra factions. In fact, actually, sources say that Jaish al-Islam is holding more than 100 of the Hayat Tahrir al-Sham HTS members in response to the continuous call to actually clear. And this is in response to civilian demands
known to be a Salafist
by the local councils, by the locals. Well, I mean, they are. I mean, we can get into the classifications, but Jaish al-Islam is not classified by the United Nations or by the international community at large as an extremist group, a la Al-qaeda or a la Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. They, in terms of their ideology, in terms of, I'm not a spokesperson on their behalf whatsoever. I'm someone who has been known to be in support of the pro-democracy civilian type of movement. We support a number of local councils on the grounds, so that's a disclaimer that needs to be made. But for those who know the political and the military map of Syria, they'll know that there are classifications of factions on the ground. And Jaish al-Islam has been actually, is the faction, if I'm not mistaken, that actually clarified the entire era, or cleared the entire era from Daesh a few years back, and it has been in constant struggle with Al-Qaeda and Nusra, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham to clear that area under very, very intense popular demand of the civilians in that area to clear them from them, because people know that these elements are being used as proxies to carpet bomb these areas, because the civilians do not agree ideologically with these elements, and that is what Jaish al-Islam and Faylaq al-Rahman have been responding to over the past few years.
Okay, Mark Kimmitt, I saw you trying to interject. Go ahead.
Well, no, I just find this whole argument back and forth. I do agree with the point that where the Russians will call everybody terrorists, there are legitimate resistance groups, pro-democracy groups inside these cities. Nonetheless, I take a look at the historical record of Rome. I see what happened in Paris during World War II, when both those cities were declared not only by the international community, but by the antagonists in the fight, open cities, so they wouldn't experience the type of violence, destruction, and collateral damage against civilians that we are now seeing in Eastern Ghouta. It's clear that these resistance forces and the extremist groups are trying to use that city as an enclave, as a sanctuary, as a safe haven, so they can continue to fight their fight. But at some point, the ideology should take second place to the human suffering that we're seeing inside that city.
Okay.
Yeah, first of all, I think it's a joke when somebody calls Jaish al-Islami or Harar al-Sham or Jabhat al-Nusra as pro-democratic forces. Pro-democratic people don't run.
They're not saying they're pro-democratic.
I did not say that.
Through the desert,
and I made a distinction between Jaish al-Islam and Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. I made a very important distinction between Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, Al-Qaeda, and Jaish al-Islam. So the Russians don't see that distinction because they have an agenda within that area.
Or you allow somebody else to talk as well. I know that this distinction between Jaish al-Islami and Harar al-Sham and Jabhat al-Nusra. But I want to say that a lot of real soldiers on the ground, they keep flags of the Jabhat al-Nusra and Jaish al-Islami and Harar al-Sham in one bag, behind of the back with them. And they can show any flags which they needed at any moment. And again, all those who are pro-democratic, they're sitting in Facebook or other social networks and fighting by words. Usually, pro-democratic people doesn't run through the desert with Kalashnikov and don't kill each other. Please recognize that there are no pro-democratic forces in all this civil war. And the problem for us, it's not to find some propagandistic idea, as you are doing, to claim some of the jihadists as pro-democratic, but to trying to move all this, not absolutely non-democratic political force, to the situation of civil war, to the situation of some kind of cold peace inside Syria, and step by step to the real peace. For doing this, please stop hateful terrorists. Well, for example, white helps, but we understand that this white helps It's joint project of the British intelligence service
But Sergey, I just have to ask you, can the Syrian regime do absolutely no wrong in Russia's eyes? Again, we're seeing the regime accused of chemical attacks, and yet you say you have proof to show that these rebel groups are actually behind the chemical warfare, yet you've come forth, Russia has come forth with nothing. Again, can the regime do no wrong? Are you only right? Are you only working for democratic forces in Syria? Can you really claim that?
No, I cannot claim this. And of course, government of Bashar al-Assad is not ideal government. And of course, they also violating human rights. And they also, before the civil war, it was no democracy in Syria. But, you know, it's usual in politics. It's usually we don't have choice between good and bad. We have the choice between different colors of bad things. And when we look at Syria, we could see that Bashar al-Assad, because he is more moderate than Jabhat al-Nusra, than Daesh, than Jaish al-Islami, than Ahrar al-Sham. And because, look at the ethnic and religious groups. Okay. Mostly, they like Bashar al-Assad. And those whom minorities like, usually they are more moderate politicians.
Mark Kimmitt, I will let you finish. I mean, is this just, I despair in saying that the only interest being fought for in Syria is just to perhaps maintain the lesser of all true evils?
Well, I don't even see it this way. At this point, I think the world understands what's going on, and the Russians should be strongly condemned for it. There may be a small cancer inside of Syria, the same cancer that the United States is going after in northern Syria. But the Russian solution, which is to take that small mole and chop off 2 arms, 2 legs, and the head to cure that cancer, is not the right solution. And for that, the Russian government should be condemned.
I'd like to thank all 3 of our panelists so much for joining us.